I've started to love that Zoom voice that says recording in progress. It's somewhat meditative and relaxing, I think. As folks come in from the waiting room, Dan, I'll turn it over to you. We've got a pretty good audience.
Sure.
You want to get started?
Yeah, thank you, Jesse. Welcome to everybody to the January CTIPP Can Call. Happy 2022. We're hoping it'll be a better year than the past year. But we're starting off with a great CTIPP Can Call. It's one that's very personal, very emotional to me. It's appropriate that this week of Martin Luther King's birthday anniversary, we're recognizing another great civil rights icon, Congressman Elijah Cummings, who also was one of the great trauma advocates. And I just want to spend a couple of seconds telling the story because I get all choked up, but it's one that is such a beautiful story, and we'll set the stage for our first presenter. Congressman learned about trauma. I really don't know how, but he recognized it helped to explain so much of the problems that the city of Baltimore faced. So he dove into it, hired a full-time staff person. It turns out the staff person was also a staff person for our first presenter, Councilman Cohen. And in record time, they organized a hearing of the House Oversight and Reform Committee, one of the powerful committees that Congressman Cummings chaired. And then CTIPP was working very closely with the staff on it. The first panel of the hearing were 4 people who had suffered trauma, different forms, a military person, somebody who had families, and someone else who suffered sexual abuse as a child. And each one of them had gone on to create an organization to help people like them overcome their trauma. So they got up and in front of 30 some odd Congress people, both sides of the aisle, told their stories. And when they finished, Congressman Cummings thanked them and said, okay, the panel's dismissed. And as the panel stood up to leave, every congressman in the room stood up and gave them a standing ovation. That's never happened before in my 50 years in Washington and anyone else's experience. It was by far the most moving hearing orchestrated by Chairman Cummings. My understanding is he had great vision of pushing through major legislation on trauma. And unfortunately, just within a few months after the hearing, he passed away. But before he did, and really while he was still pretty sick, as I understand, he came to this roundtable in a wheelchair. He organized a roundtable for the city of Baltimore to talk about how trauma-informed approaches could make a difference in the city of Baltimore. And that the ripples from that roundtable is what we're going to be hearing about from our first speaker. So the legacy of Congressman Cummings lives on, is making a difference in Baltimore, and he will always have a very special place in our hearts. With that, I'd like, Deborah Berkey, are you on? Okay, let me turn it over to Jesse. And by the way, I didn't.
Sorry, I am sorry. I was trying to unmute. I had you minimized. That's okay.
Yeah, but I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Dan Press. I'm the General Counsel of CTIPP, and my co-host Jesse Kohler is the Executive Director of CTIPP. And I think this is our 3rd or 4th year of CTIPP Can. It's really going to be a wonderful family of participants. So all of you, welcome, and we look forward to you joining us. Deb, you want to talk a little bit about your initiative?
Sure, I'd love to. Thank you, Dan. I'm Deb Berkey. I'm Director of Psychology Programs in the Center for Prevention Science at Wilmington University in Delaware. And over this past year, Wilmington University, in collaboration with grassroots, now new 501c3 organization called Trauma Matters Delaware, has been working alongside one of our healthcare systems to help them begin the journey to become a trauma-informed organization. And so we are finishing up year one of the journey, phase one, which was becoming trauma aware across the organization. We've trained approximately 2,500 individuals in the organization on the concepts of becoming what it means to be trauma-informed. And we were planning year two, transitioning to what does it mean to become trauma sensitive and then trauma responsive. And in our initial planning, the concept came up of a community of practice, or in some organizations or some settings, we might call it a community of learners, where you bring together individuals who've got common interests and common curiosities, wanting to learn, wanting to share resources together to pool our collective talents and knowledge and help each other become better representatives of whatever we are, in this case, healthcare organizations. And so the healthcare organization that I'm working with would love to see if we could create a community of practice with other healthcare organizations across the US. And so what that community of practice might look like is going to be co-created with the organizations that are interested in joining. What I'm doing is making a pitch. If you know any organizations that are healthcare ones that are working on the trauma informed continuum or are working to become trauma informed, that might be interested in being part of this larger collaborative where you share, again, knowledge, resources, that kind of thing. Let me know what that community of practice looks like. Will be co-created by the organizations that join it. So it could be anything from monthly hour-long meetings to bi-monthly, to bringing in individuals as guest speakers, to sharing examples of policies and practices that have been revised, to the sky's the limit. So I'm going to put in chat, again, my name and my contact info. And if you have questions, feel free to reach out to me and I'd be more than happy to answer them.
Thanks so much, Deb.
Deborah. And Deborah has agreed to chair the community. We really appreciate that, taking on that responsibility. CTIPP's available to help you any way we can. Borrow our Zoom system if you need it, but we really look forward to some great things coming out of that. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. I appreciate your support.
And appreciate the language around community of learners. I absolutely love that, and will steal that. And if I do not appropriately credit you with that at any future date, please know that you taught me that today. Two more items to discuss before we turn it over to our wonderful presenters from DC. So one is that there is a new bill that was introduced in Congress during the fall, but is starting to really take off in a pretty exciting and bipartisan way, called the Post-Disaster Mental Health Response Act. It's bipartisan, and essentially what this bill would do is, currently FEMA provides counseling services when there is a major disaster declaration. And so the biggest disasters that you can think of, some of the funding from FEMA can be used for mental health counseling, essentially. When there is an emergency declaration, that same support is not necessarily provided as well. And so what this bill would do is amend FEMA's funding stream to allow for emergency declarations as well as major disaster declarations to fund crisis counseling services in the aftermath of disasters. This is a very bipartisan bill that has been introduced in the House. Currently, there are 6 Republican representatives and 3 Democratic representatives who have already co-sponsored the legislation. And the bill it's being marked up in committee currently. And it's also currently looking for bipartisan Senate co-sponsors as well. And so we know that this is probably going to move forward pretty soon on the Senate side as well. I put the link in the chat for more information. And if you have relationships with your congressional offices, please feel free to let them know about this bill, whether they're interested in co-sponsoring or just to vote and support this legislation as it continues to move forward. And as we've done in the past, for next month or probably in the meantime between this CTIPP can call and our February CTIPP can call, we'll put together one of those easy call to actions where you can just fill in your information, send some information about the bill to your elected officials, your federal elected officials. And we appreciate all of the support and mobilization that our advocates always show. We get a lot of praise from different congressional offices about the action from the National Trauma Campaign, especially that grassroots aspect. People love hearing from their constituents, especially those who are passionate about the issues that they advocate for, like we have such a great community of here. And so wanted to let you all know about that. We'll continue to update you with information as that bill moves forward. The other thing in terms of building the movement and continuing to build momentum is an invitation for those of you who weren't able to attend the last workshop to sign up for our free Building the Movement to Prevent Trauma and Foster Resilience workshop series. The first session, which was January 7th, was fantastic. Over 1,000 people joined. We now have over 2,000 people signed up. So we're really excited to continue to build momentum. This Friday is the second session. It's from 1 to 5 p.m. Eastern time. We recognize that that is a long period of time. And so know that we also record all the sessions, get resources. We'll continue to share and build upon all of that. But we invite you to sign up for free. Join when you can. This next, on Friday, we're going to have presentations about the education system and the healthcare system. And then, as always, that 5 to 6 p.m. Eastern time, we have breakout rooms so that people can process, break down if they're ready and willing to go for a 5th hour of discovery and exploration together. We have that available as well. You can find all of that information on the website. We appreciate everybody who signed up, who has sent information to others. Please continue to let other folks know. We want to continue to build a movement and are excited about not just the rest of this workshop session, but then future years and continuing to build the movement alongside all of you. With that said,
Let me jump
Go
in.
ahead, Dan.
Yeah, the real goal of the workshop is to help local trauma-informed coalitions get the tools they need to make their communities trauma-informed. So it will be how to make your education sector trauma-informed and how to make your health sector trauma-informed are the agendas for this Friday. Future ones, how to make your law enforcement sector trauma-informed, how to make your child welfare system trauma-informed. So it's really intended as a practical how-to, hands-on, because we recognize the country is going to become trauma-informed. The movement depends on local trauma-informed coalitions forming and being effective in making their communities trauma-informed. So they're the target, the focus of it, and we hope you will be able to join us. Okay, Jesse, 2:15, right on time.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah. Everything that we do, we hope gets down into the grassroots because that's where healing happens, right, in the context of healthy relationships over time. And there's a great presenter to discuss one such initiative today, which is Councilman Zeke Cohen from Baltimore City. Zeke started his nonprofit, The Intersection, to help young people learn community organizing and civic leadership. He ran for office with the belief that democracy only works when everyone has a voice in the process. In July of 2019, Zeke introduced the Elijah Cummings Healing Cities Act to make Baltimore the first city in the country to comprehensively legislate trauma-informed care, which we're going to hear a lot more about today. He's also sponsored the gender-inclusive single-user restroom bill and introduced a transparency in lobbying act. Zeke and his staff work tirelessly to deliver world-class constituent services and to provide transparency throughout the process. With no further ado, Councilman Cohen, thank you for joining us today. The floor is yours.
No, thank you. It's really an honor to get to be with you all. Thank you, Jesse and Dan and everybody else. I heard a lot about you all when my former chief of staff and good friend Mike Castagnola was working for Congressman Cummings. He said this coalition was awesome and that you guys got the job done. So I am really grateful for the work that you're doing and excited to share a little bit about what we've been up to in Baltimore. Iris, could you put the presentation up? Awesome. All right. So this work for me started in 2019, as Jesse mentioned, when there was actually a school shooting at Frederick Douglass High School. It was during school hours. A gentleman walked into the building with a gun, fired multiple shots, and critically wounded one of the school staff. And this is a shooting that I would gander most of you did not hear about. And I think it's worth noting that when there are school shootings in predominantly Black communities, we don't hear as much about it on the news. But for the young people that were there, it was incredibly traumatizing, as well as for the staff and really just the whole community. It was a horrible event. We experienced a lot of violence in Baltimore, but to have it happen in a school, which is supposed to be a safe, sacred space, was just really devastating. Next slide, please. And so we decided to call a city council hearing. The theme was youth voices, youth violence. And we really wanted to hear directly from young people about their experiences and what we as the city council could do to reduce violence. And a lot of the adult conversation at the time was about, should we have our school police be armed when they're in schools? Should we have more metal detectors? Like very heavily focused on what we could do from a policing standpoint to prevent violence. But when the young people got up to testify, they wanted nothing to do with that conversation. And on this slide, you see Jayana, Damani, and Brianna, who were juniors at Frederick Douglass at the time, and who described in very vivid detail what it was like to have to duck and hide in place while bullets were flying right outside of their classroom. And what they said to us really clearly was, you all spend way too much time talking about how to police us. You need to spend some more time thinking about how to prevent violence from occurring in the first place. And specifically, you need to start thinking about how you can prevent trauma that impacts our lives. And they went and named every single ACE in the book. They spoke about their experiences with homelessness, having a family member that was substance addicted, dealing with abandonment, just the day-to-day experiences of growing up Black in a city that was one of the birthplaces of racial redlining. And they really called on us as city leaders to directly address trauma that's impacted their lives and the lives of their peers. And look, I'm a former public school teacher, and when you hear young people speak with that level of clarity and conviction, it behooves you to listen and to follow up. And so I beelined it to those students right after the hearing and said, all right, I'm really impressed by what you guys had to say. Let's figure this out together. You know, you've called on us to come up with something to do with trauma. Let's see what we can do. Next slide, please. And so we started a citywide listening tour. We listened in libraries, in laundromats, in rec centers, in classrooms, all across Baltimore. And what we were trying to figure out was, what could we do from a legislative perspective? Because that is, at the end of the day, that is my job. I am a legislator. I get to make the laws in the great city of Baltimore, or at least I am one of 14 on the city council. And so we went around and we spoke to groups of students, elders, folks from every walk of life about how we could legislate a response to trauma. And what was interesting was, at the time, we also started to look nationally. And of course, this coalition came up. We spoke to a bunch of folks in Washington State. We talked to some people, just heard Wilmington and Delaware, New Jersey, in Philadelphia, where the urban ACEs study had taken place. We really wanted to not be parochial, to hear ideas from all over the country and really the world. But what was interesting was that we found out that no other city, or no city at that point, had actually legislated comprehensively a response to trauma. And the thing that we knew, and the thing that we heard again and again and again, is if our response, if our legislation didn't feel indigenous to Baltimore, didn't feel like it fit within our city, that it wasn't going to work. It can't be something from New York or DC or LA. It's got to be from here. Next slide, please. And so after this year of listening, we wrote a bill and we pulled folks together, and we held what we called our first Healing City Summit. We started at the Great Morgan State University, which is one of our city's 2 historically Black colleges and universities. And we had about 350 young people, youth from around the city, give TED Talks, panels, poetry on how we could heal from trauma. Because again, we wanted to really keep the lens on our young people, since they had been the driving force behind this work. And so that's what you see in front of you. Next slide, please. This young woman delivered an incredible poem about her own experiences around healing, and then quite literally dropped the mic. Next slide, please. And so the next day, we went over to Coppin State, which is our other HBCU. And we held an enormous Healing City community fair, where we had folks from all over Baltimore, people like Annette from Roberta's House, which is a premier grief counseling center, folks like Joe from the Center for Urban Families, which works with families who have experienced incarceration and come out. We worked with all these different organizations. We set up a huge resource fair. And this was really interesting to me, we brought in a ton of barbers and beauticians, because believe it or not, when we were going around having all these conversations about trauma, barbers raised their hands and said, listen, you need to write us into this thing, because we too are healers in our communities. Because guess what? When someone gets into that chair, they are vulnerable. We have deep conversations, and we put hands on people, like literally on their head, in a way that is healing. And, I'll never forget this guy, Troy Stanton, who is an amazing barber in West Baltimore, runs a nonprofit. He had been shot in his own barber shop. And I remember him saying to me, Zeke, we put our hands on the victims of violence, and we put our hands on the shooters too. And that touch can be extremely healing, and it can prevent someone from making a really big mistake. And so we wanted to make sure our barbers and beauticians were part of the work as well. Next slide, please. And then we marched collectively over to Frederick Douglass High School. So this was the Frederick Douglass High School marching band. There's me and a bunch of my colleagues, as well as a huge group of community coming behind. I should say that, I know that Dan had spoken about Congressman Cummings, and that is absolutely true. He was a true leader in this work. He, of course, chaired the first ever congressional hearing, as you all were a part of. And then, yeah, he called us together at Humanum to really drive this work forward. And I remember him saying, and he was a major mentor in my life and just incredible friend, role model, all the rest. And I remember him saying to me, listen, literally putting his arm on my shoulder and saying, listen, Cohen, I don't have that much longer, so I'm going to need you to pick up this ball and keep running with it. And that actually meant the world to me. And so he passed away before we had completed the bill. And so I amended it to rename it the Elijah Cummings Healing City Act in his honor. Next slide, please. And so then we went back to Frederick Douglass High School, which, if you'll recall, was where that shooting had taken place. And the same three students, Jayana, Damani, and Brianna, spoke about what it was like to not just have experienced a horrific, traumatic event, but to actually then take power back into their own hands and do something about it and help to write legislation for an entire city. And it was incredibly powerful to hear them speak as it had been the first time. Next slide, please. And then right there at Frederick Douglass, then Mayor Jack Young signed our bill, thus making Baltimore the first city in the country to legislate trauma-informed care. And right behind, if you could go back just a little bit, right behind Mayor Young is Maya Rockymore Cummings, who was the congressman's wife, also an amazing public health person as well. The students behind us, and then some of my colleagues on the city council. Next slide, please. So what does our bill do? The Elijah Cummings Healing City Act creates a task force of 38 people to assist in the development of a citywide strategy toward an organizational culture shift into trauma responsive government. I am blessed to get to chair our task force, and it is an amazing group, everyone from returning citizens to physicians, clinicians, educators, nonprofit people, barbers, just the whole gamut. Our bill calls for training for all city agencies on trauma-informed care. I'm going to talk about that a little more in a minute, but every city agency must get trained, and it is not a one and done. It is not like an hour and a half thing. It is a year-long, intensive, deep training to try to shift culture. And the third thing our bill does is it calls on each of the agencies to review their policies and procedures with our task force to ensure that they are indeed trauma-informed and equitable. So we really wanted this legislation to both do the training, to have community baked into it, and to really look with a critical, hard eye at our policies so that we could realign and become a better city. Next slide, please. So this is our faculty for our training curriculum. What was really important to me was that we made sure it was all centered on Baltimoreans, right? Because we are the medicine, we are the arbiters of our own healing, and we have incredible people in our city, as you all, I'm sure, do in your own municipalities. But too often what happens in a place like Baltimore is that people want to look outside and want to bring in a consultant from wherever. And what we said is we don't need to do that because we have the brilliance and the expertise right here. So Dr. Lawrence Brown, who wrote The Black Butterfly, professor, amazing. Shauna Murray Brown is this incredible healer. She's getting her PhD right now. She does healing circles for Black women. Ollie and Atman Smith run Holistic Life Foundation. If you don't know these guys, you should. They're incredible. Two brothers from West Baltimore. They focus on mindfulness. They teach in schools. Dr. Tara Doherty runs Sage Wellness. She's incredible. Again, Annette March Greer, who runs Roberta's House. So just, all stars. And then also that wanted to make sure you all saw. The Youth Healing Alliance, which is a local group in Baltimore of young people that does healing work, are also part of our faculty, and everybody gets paid. Next slide, please. So this is our task force getting sworn in. This was a great day. That's Mayor Brandon Scott swearing us all in. Again, some really incredible people, just healers all around. Next slide, please. Since then, our task force has split into 5 subcommittees. The first one is focused on developing trauma responsive practices across medical institutions. And they've actually been working directly in partnership with a church in Southeast Baltimore. It's a predominantly Hispanic congregation, one that has a lot of concerns about healthcare and also has a lot of issues with access. And so what they've done is started to embed mental health care within the church. They've hired some of the parishioners to be mental health care navigators and have created sort of this hub of mental health in this church in Southeast Baltimore. We have a subcommittee that's focused on creating policies. Right now, they are looking at a whole policy review on the ways in which racism and white supremacy have impacted our laws in Baltimore. We have a subcommittee focused on youth programs. Their charge has been around youth homelessness and decreasing it. They've also been convening a partnership of our 3 schools of social work, Morgan State, Coppin State, and University of Maryland, to try to create a joint certificate with a focus on trauma. We have a group that's focused on training and assessment. They are working with our faculty on our trainings. And then we have a group that's focused on decolonizing. And this was a new concept to me, but the idea is a lot of the way we've been taught to think about mental health comes from a Western colonial lens and frame. And this sort of practice honors Indigenous, African, Latino folks as arbiters of their own healing. And so they are working with our Office of Civil Rights to develop a whole set of curricula for city agencies to think through a decolonizing lens. Next slide, please. So this was an article in the Trace. The first agency that we wanted to start with was actually our library system. Baltimore has a phenomenal library system in Enoch Pratt. And we wanted to start there because librarians tend to be little social workers in and of themselves. 21st century library is not just a place to go get books. It is often a place to get nourishment and healing. And it's also a place where you see a lot of trauma, right? Like folks who've experienced homelessness, folks who are struggling with substance use. And so we wanted to start there. Next slide, please. So one of the ways that our library system has rethought their own policies is prior to this work, they had a zero tolerance policy for anyone that was inebriated in the library. So if you came in, if you smelled of weed, if you were high, if you were drunk, they kick you out and not let you back in, right? We now know in the year 2022 of our Lord that addiction is a disease. It is a mental health disorder. Substance use disorder is not some personal or moral failing. And so to just kick someone out doesn't actually solve the problem, and it just reinforces the stigma and puts someone back on the street. So in her great wisdom, the director of the library system, Heidi Daniels, decided instead of going with that policy, instead, we're going to bring peer recovery coaches into our libraries so that we can support people where they are. And that's one of our awesome peer recovery coaches. Next slide, please. So this was a couple weeks ago. Baltimore implements trauma-informed care practices. This was an announcement we did with the mayor, that the mayor was setting aside 1.4 million into being able to implement our law, which I'm going to talk about the need for money in 1 second. Next slide, please. All right, so here is kind of our jumbled funding sources. We got an initial start from Open Society Institute. They gave us a big grant, and that was really helpful. We've gotten some money from donations and foundations. The city of Baltimore, through our budget, has invested about $340,000, and then we just got ARPA money, American Rescue Plan Act money. So we've got about $2.34 million for this work so far. Next slide, please. So here are some key lessons learned. Number one is that legislation matters. I think what has made our work sustainable and what I hope will make it outlive me is that it is in law, and that legislation really has some power behind it and creates some juice and some real authority that commands respect. It's very easy. New mayors come in all the time, new city council people, everybody's got a great idea. The administration wants to do this. It's really easy, I think, for trauma-informed to be a great buzzy trend and then for it to go away if someone in power wants it to go away. So I will just say to all the folks on this call that I think your instinct of lobbying in DC is right on, because I really think that the law and legislation matters. Number two is that this work takes funding, and that's why I wanted to show you kind of the money side of this, is that I think too often people neglect the piece around how much it actually costs to do this work with fidelity, right? Like, you got to pay people. Folks aren't just going to volunteer their time. And if they are volunteering their time, to me, it can really quickly feel exploitive of people's labor. And so we've made it a principle to pay, and pay well, for people's work. And I think that's just really, really, really important. Number three is that, the saying, we're the medicine. We believe that our own community has the expertise and knowledge to heal, that we don't need to rely on, folks from other cities. That's not to be provincial. We still want to know what's going on all over the place, but it is to say that communities have a lot of power within them, and we should lean on it. Number four is that it can't just be in government. Community needs to be invested in compelling the work forward. We've kept this Healing City movement going, and that's been a big part of why the work stays relevant. And then number five is that systems change is a long game. I will not probably see the fruits of my labor. My hope is that this is multi-generational work, and that we are able to ultimately change dynamics in our city, but that is going to take a really, really, really long time. And so while we are working with an evaluator from the Bloomberg School of Public Health to look at some short-term outcomes, I'm also really clear that this is not going to immediately stop the murder rate in Baltimore. This is not going to, there's no miracles here. It is just long, hard work. Next slide, please. And so just in terms of cross collaboration, one of the things I think a lot about is seeing this work across cities and states. I think having it come from the ground up is really important, as well as having this national movement that you all are pushing. Our bill was adopted at the state level in Maryland, and Delegate Lewis and Senator Jill Carter passed a version of it in the legislature last term, and we've got a whole commission at the state level too, which is great. And we always want Baltimore, because our city takes a lot of hits, quite frankly, we always want Baltimore to be at the forefront, because the brilliance, the innovation, just the incredible chutzpah that our young people have, and that they led and pushed for this bill, I think is remarkable. And so we always want to, put ourselves and our youth out there, and to say that, we can do this all over the place. So with that, I really, really, really appreciate you all, the work you're doing, and the time you've given me, and any questions, comments, and everything else. Back to you, Jesse.
Councilman Cohen, thank you so much. There are a number of questions. I have 6 of them so far in the queue, and we'll get to those after Claudia's presentation. Please keep questions coming in the chat box. It's fantastic. One thing that I want to highlight to our community advocacy network from Councilman Cohen's presentation very quickly is just that all of the work that's transpired over the last 3 or so years happened because a group of advocates spoke up to what they were experiencing, right? Their lived experiences helped to move Councilman Cohen, which helped to put wheels in motion, which has resulted so far in $2.34 million of investment and a heck of a lot of great work that we're excited to see continue to go on. So Councilman Cohen, thank you so much again for that presentation, and looking forward to your answers in the Q&A. Next, from Baltimore to the state of Maryland, Claudia Remington is the executive director of the Maryland State Council on Child Abuse and Neglect. SCAN advises Maryland's governor and General Assembly on systems improvement to prevent, detect, prosecute, and treat child abuse and neglect. Ms. Remington provides, sorry, I lost that when you brought up the screen, but that's okay. Consensus building, leadership, research, writing, and organizational support to SCAN. She facilitates the collaborative work of 23 council members representing diverse perspectives, sectors, disciplines, and communities. Under her leadership, the council adopted a public health approach to preventing child maltreatment before it occurs. Claudia, thank you so much for being with us today. Looking forward to your presentation.
Yeah, let me jump in, because none of that captures what Claudia is. She is a dynamo that has really made trauma-informed voices heard in the nation, in the state capitol. I've had the opportunity to walk the halls of the state legislature with her, and she knows everybody, and she's just a mover, and she really is the spark behind Maryland's trauma-informed initiative, and it's really a joy for me to be able to call her a friend. So welcome, Claudia.
I feel the same way, Dan. Thank you, to be called your friend as well. Jesse already, and thank you, Jesse, for the invitation to come and speak, and Dan both. I want to talk to you today about SCAN and its partners' creation of a statewide initiative and alliance of hundreds of organizations that we call Maryland Essentials for Childhood. The goals of the Essentials for Childhood are to promote safe, stable, and nurturing relationships and environments for children, and prevent and mitigate adverse childhood experiences. Maryland Essentials for Childhood is a statewide collective impact initiative to prevent child maltreatment and other ACEs. It promotes relationships and environments that help children to grow up to be healthy and productive citizens, so they in turn can build stronger and safer families and communities for their children, a multi-generational approach. Maryland Essentials for Childhood is made possible by an alliance of hundreds of multi-sector public and private agencies. You can see a number of these. These are maybe a tenth of the organizations involved. And the State Council on Child Abuse and Neglect and the Family Tree, which is our Prevent Child Abuse America chapter, provide in-kind services for backbone support of Maryland Essentials for Childhood. When community members learn about ACEs, or the neuroscience, neurobiology, epigenetics, ACEs, and resilience, they want to know what action can be taken. Everyone can play a role. The answer to what action each agency or individual depends on various roles they play in their organization, community, or state. SCAN and Maryland Essentials for Childhood find our roles in the upper tiers of the socio-ecological model, especially in advocating for changes in public policy. This is where we have focused our efforts to develop and advocate for state policy and infrastructure and their effective implementation to promote safe, stable, nurturing relationships and environments, and to prevent ACEs. So to give some background, the State Council is a CAPTA panel, or Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, or a citizen review panel. It's made up of citizens across the state that are interested and have experience and expertise in child abuse and neglect. We're an independent council in Maryland Family Law Article 5-7A. And we make recommendations annually to the governor and the General Assembly on matters relating to the prevention, detection, prosecution, and treatment of child abuse and neglect. We develop this annual report each year, and we have used it since 2006, I believe, to educate folks around ACEs, and especially our policymakers, give them some background and promote policies across the state that will prevent adverse childhood experiences. So as Zeke said, this is not a short game. This is a series of either marathons or I'd say even Ironman events. And I really appreciate this quote by Gandhi that one of our council members had brought forth at the very beginning, because it's been really helpful to stay in the game. First, they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. And this has proven very true here in Maryland. We wrote recommendations for many years that were ignored. After a while, people started, kind of laughing, and then all of a sudden they saw that some of it was being accomplished and started to fight us. And so we've won many of the policy battles that we've worked towards. So Maryland Essentials for Childhood has adopted the four strategic goals of the CDC's Essentials for Childhood initiative. For those familiar with the initiative, you know that its focus is on preventing child maltreatment, but Maryland, since we were an unfunded state, decided that we were going to focus it on ACEs and the neuroscience, or the neurobiology, epigenetics, ACEs, and resilience. So we've spent the last 10 plus years working on these goals, and I'm going to go through each of them and some of the accomplishments that we've had in Maryland policies. So the first one is to raise awareness of the neuroscience and a commitment to action. And we've been involved in multiple things, as you can see on the screen. I'm not going to go through each of these, but we use our SCAN meetings to educate folks across these multiple agencies, both public and private. And we were involved in the first congressional hearing on childhood trauma and informing that in Congressman Cummings' Baltimore City Trauma Act roundtable. And we have provided an ACEs roundtable for members of the General Assembly. But one of the biggest things I think that we've done, and most successful things to move this forward, is called the ACE Interface Project. And this started in 2017, the end of 2017. And we brought Laura Porter and Dr. Rob Anda in to train a cohort of ACE interface master trainers. We were very strategic in selecting those trainers, and across multiple agencies, many sectors. We had a member of the General Assembly, judge, foundation, member of foundation, law enforcement, early childhood, mental health and care, community members, faith-based organizations, all represented in this group of folks that we trained, so that they could go and train people within their agencies. We also had a reception, an ACE interface reception, at a local Baltimore art gallery, and we invited top policymakers in the child and family serving agencies in Maryland. They got to meet the folks that were going to be trained, and they got to meet and hear from Dr. Porter, Dr. Anda and Laura Porter around ACEs. I'm gonna go back. I'm gonna go back to the last. One thing, one example of something that happened out of that was that we had a law enforcement officer that came, who was brought in. He was a top law enforcement officer in one of our local ACE collaboratives. And he really poo-pooed, and was very defensive when he walked in the door. But he folded his arms. He listened to me. This seems all touchy-feely trauma. And he has become a huge advocate in Harford County for trauma-informed practices now. So some of the most people that don't take on right away will join you if you keep fighting. So the second goal is to use data to inform action. And we were very strategic in how we went about doing this, as far as learning about the behavioral risk factor survey, collection of ACE data within that, and in the YRBS data. And we brought the head coordinator, the BRFIS coordinator, to educate us about the behavioral risk factor survey and the political process for deciding on which questions would be included. We were told that it would take us most likely years to get it done. We alerted our Maryland Essentials for Childhood partners when the selection process was happening, and we drafted a response, and it was shared by 20 to 30 of our partners with the health department. And in the first year, the 8 questions of the ACE module were included in our BRFIS, and we had data to go to the General Assembly with, as far as how ACEs impacted Maryland citizens. Then we had a group of local folks in one of our local coalitions, actually in Baltimore City, that wanted to have more specific data around the, youth. And so we started to look at how ACE questions were used in the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, and looked at Monroe County in New York, which was the only jurisdiction that was really using ACE questions in their YRBS. And this survey, the YRBS survey, for those that don't know, really looks at high school and middle schoolers. It surveys high school and middle schoolers, so you get quite a big pool. And when we first looked at having this done in Maryland, we realized that our brand new YRBS coordinator really had not known about this ACE study. So we educated her about that. She got very enthusiastic, asked the CDC to put the questions in the YRBS, if we could put the questions in the YRBS, Maryland's YRBS, and we got a no from the CDC. And so through our technical assistance with the CDC, we knew that Melissa Merrick, who ran the ACEs work at the CDC, and said, we have silos too. We had a meeting. Everybody got our health department, their divisions in the CDC, and Maryland became one of the first of 2 states to collect that data. And our local, how important this is to our local jurisdictions, the YRBS data is collected at the at a jurisdictional level. So our local ACE collaboratives are using this to inform the action of many of their interventions in the state. It's really been fascinating information. We've also, last year, one of the senators who attended our ACEs roundtable sponsored SB 548, which institutionalized the collection of ACE data in the YRBS and expanded the collection of data to middle schoolers, requiring a certain analysis and reporting to be done every year. We've also, the third goal, recently we started to study, we had multiple interventions under this. We created an infant mental health association of Maryland and DC. and through our ACE interface project, had 2 projects with the opioid regrounding our response initiative in Maryland and our local education agencies. We've trained 3 cohorts there to really impact the education system. But recently, we've looked at safe baby courts, and we have one safe baby court in Frederick County that is very multidisciplinary, and we developed recommendations and put these in our annual report to the Department of Human Services and the Administrative Office of the Courts to expand safe baby courts in Maryland, as they have in Tennessee, across the state. So the 4th goal, creating the context for healthy children through near science informed policies. We have raised the awareness of our policymakers to the near science, and really pushed for them to employ near science and the under each of the strategies of the CDC's preventing adverse childhood experiences, leveraging the best available evidence document. And these are some of the things that we did. We were very active in the Enough Abuse campaign. This was more specific to preventing child sexual abuse. We were part of the legislative work group to study child custody proceedings involving allegations of child abuse and domestic violence, which really looked at court systems, the custody systems to become trauma informed. And then we had the ACEs roundtable for the Maryland General Assembly and developed a legislative brief. So these are the 6 policies. The good news is everyone knows on this call that ACEs are preventable and resilience can be built through policy and practice that supports healthy development. The CDC produced this resource and to help states and communities take advantage of the best available evidence. And so we have really looked at these 6 buckets of these 6 strategies of policies that really promote safe, stable, nurturing relationships and environment for kids and prevent ACEs before they occur. And we've really focused around this, including at our roundtable that we held for members of the General Assembly in December of 2019, just before the pandemic. We held a full day roundtable. It was sponsored by Delegate Vanessa Atterbury, who was one of our ACE interface master trainers. She came to the 3-day training that Robert Anda and Laura Porter put on, and Senator Antonio Hayes from Baltimore City hosted the roundtable for members of the General Assembly. It was a full day. Dan also participated, and we brought ACE champion policymakers from Delaware and Tennessee, the National Conference on State Legislatures, experts from the CDC, SAMHSA, and Prevent Child Abuse America, as well as local community members and providers that are putting the science of ACEs into action on the ground to speak with our legislators and provide planning. And we provided time for planning for legislators to think through the next steps. These efforts led to interest by the Hogan administration in developing policy around ACEs, and we presented to the governor's coordinating offices and met with agency secretaries as part of the Opioid Operational Command Center, which is one of Governor Hogan's big initiatives. And we also, Dan and I met with the Lieutenant Governor and the chair of the Children's Cabinet to promote these policies. This all built the foundation for our successful advocacy to participate with other states in the National Governors Association State ACEs Learning Collaborative, and led to an ACEs executive order by Governor Hogan and 45 million in ARPA funding to Boys and Girls Clubs through Project Bounce Back. We followed up, at the General Assembly roundtable with a ACEs Education and Advocacy Day at the General Assembly in February 2020, and awarded each member that attended the ACE roundtable a copy of, we had an artist, a graphic artist, capture each of the sessions around ACEs, and we framed them and awarded them to members of the General Assembly who attended, so that they can hang them in their office and be reminded of the work they did and the promises that they wanted to keep around this important science. So we also followed up with developing this legislative brief toward a more prosperous Maryland, giving background around ACEs, but also giving them legislators examples of work that's gone on in other state, legislation that's passed in other state. We broke it down into 5 legislative mechanisms that were being used by legislatures to prevent and mitigate ACEs, and also the 6 strategies of the CDC, and gave examples from other states, and really shared whether Maryland had made progress in each of those areas. So we also worked on specific legislation from to prevent and mitigate ACEs, and these varied widely. They're wide ranging, as you can see, and they address ACEs collectively and within multiple systems, but as well as in addressing ACEs, individual ACEs within specific child and family serving agencies and systems. I'll go through a few examples of what it took to achieve this significant progress. So under the strategy of strengthening economic support for families, we worked with the Working Matters Coalition to pass paid sick and safe leave for families in Maryland. And we are working currently with the Time to Care Coalition, which is made up of hundreds of organizations fighting for paid family leave in Maryland. And House Bill 8 is being spoken of as we go.
2 grades, 2 management, and 1 day staff.
We've also, we have done extensive work around child sexual abuse. This is about comprehensive child sexual abuse prevention legislation. And from our work in 2011 with the Enough Abuse campaign, through legislation passing Aaron's Law, comprehensive prevention of education for school personnel in 2018, what's called the Sesame Act, or some people call it passing the trash, and some guidelines for assessment of the physical facilities, making those safe for kids, as well as reform of the civil statute of limitations, which we call the Hidden Creditor Act. And many of these things make many of the environments kids live in, go to school in, and play in safer from child sexual abuse and prevent one of the ACEs. We've also worked specifically within the child welfare system. Many of the, most of our foster youth have multiple ACEs, as we know, and we've worked towards collecting, having, there's a child welfare medical director who is responsible for really looking at what is happening health-wise to kids in child welfare, both their physical and mental health needs, dental health needs. It's really not monitored well. And our preamble, this was the first bill, HB 1582 in 2018 that mentions adverse childhood experiences in Maryland. We've also are looking at child wealth. We passed the child welfare medical data bill, child welfare, I'm sorry, this child welfare system data bill, which requires collecting data by race and in multiple data points by race, which are not collected now. We learned that a third of our kids in the child welfare system, information on race has not even been collected in the system. So we really can improve systems, especially our systems that are impacted by racial inequities if we don't have the facts. So, and the council has developed an anti-racist statement, which outlined the history of systemic racism in the child welfare system, and has committed to educating our members around this and the other systems that are impacted, and legislation that will undo racism within the child welfare system. I think I mentioned this, the work group to study court proceedings involving child abuse or domestic violence allegations. A bill that came out of this report that's being put forward this year is this bill on training judges around creating a trauma-informed court around these custody hearings. And we also supported a bill, HB 277, to create trauma-informed guidelines for our school systems. And finally, I would say the what Councilman Cohen was talking about, the Trauma-Informed Commission. We were the last year in 2021, May 1st, the governor signed an executive order on ACEs that can ensure that state agencies consider how the implementation of state policies and program could reduce ACEs, provide data to the governor's, the executive director of the governor's Office of Crime Prevention, Youth and Victim Services, to facilitate study and monitor state policies, and that child and family serving agencies must incorporate an understanding of ACEs into treatment and care models. And it also establishes May 6th as ACE Awareness Day. The Trauma-Informed Commission passed both houses of the General Assembly April 12th, 2021. It was not signed by the governor, but it became law on May 30th without the governor's signature. Just to briefly look at what our commission looks like at the state level. All the child and family serving agencies have representation, the secretaries or their designees. SCAN is, I'm a member as the executive director of SCAN. And then there are 16 appointees, which for a total of 29 members. It's heavily mental health expertise, but everybody has to have an expertise in trauma. I'd say missing from the group are some key private partners like foundations, businesses, faith-based communities, and local community ACE collaboratives, although there is representative from local government. These are other office departments in the state that are also required. They're not included on the commission, but they are required to become trauma informed. The purpose of the commission is to prioritize trauma responsive and trauma informed delivery of state services that impact children, youth, families, and older adults. And these are the mandates. Assist in the development of a statewide strategy towards organizational culture shift into a trauma responsive state, establish metrics to evaluate and assess progress of the initiative. There's supposed to be a survey of programs and services. It's rather broadly stated in number 1 up there. That could be overwhelming mandate of the commission. And then they are supposed to coordinate and develop trauma-informed training with the health department and disseminate best practices across the different agencies, and advise and assist the governor in providing oversight and accountability. They are also required to do reports each year that make recommendations as well to improve existing laws relating to children, youth, families, and older adults. I think this was a really important piece of it, of the commission legislation. Each agency head has to appoint 2 staff members who participate in formal training, and then also work together across agencies with each other in work sessions and other informal trainings organized by the health department to turn the state agencies into trauma responsive and trauma informed agencies. They have to also assess how the agency is doing related to the need, what technical assistance they need, let their secretaries know about that. And they also need to review and make recommendations to the agency director on agency policies and practices with a trauma-informed approach. That information will be included in the reports that the commission sends to the General Assembly and the governor. And this was an amendment. An additional function was to study, develop, and implement an ACEs Aware program similar to that in California. This was put in by one of the legislators, and the commission will need to look at this and start to study whether this is something that should be brought about in Maryland as well. So some of the challenges and opportunities of the commission staff, agency staffing metrics, and ACEs are unfunded mandates. There is no funding. That our governor develops the budget. He didn't sign this commission legislation. I'm not sure what that means for staffing metrics and the ACEs Aware mandates. But there is as an opportunity here, an increase, an ability to increase budgetary commitments to this work. We have seen that the governor do that with Project Bounce Back, and there are other ARPA funds that could be used to do the work of the commission. So membership is heavily mental health and government agencies of the commission. So very few, a few community members, but many unrepresented voices. The opportunity here is that committee can be made up of outside the official membership. I think leadership, understanding, and buy-in can be an issue. This is something that was mandated by the General Assembly. Some of the secretaries do not have an understanding, and there may not be buy-in, and they can send a designee, and we know what that means. So as far as a commitment to doing the work, there are, I think the agency designated leads, the two staff people who are advising the secretaries, are going to be a very critical part of the legislation. We did have eight of our ACE interface master trainers are serving on the commission, so that there is that background and understanding that can be shared. There are some concerns about the narrow reading of trauma-informed care, and it will be important to include foundational the neuroscience, the epigenetics, neurobiology, ACEs and resilience science, as well as communication science, and in the context of racial inequities, if state agencies are going to be truly trauma-informed. And there's also a risk of, like any of these unfunded mandates, a risk of checking boxes, and the amount of time that's spent is just monthly at this point. So we're hoping that that might improve. So lessons learned from the work that we've done across these many policy measures is that really important to have a consensus building etiquette, and we did that right from the beginning. We include, anyone is able to come to our Maryland Essentials for Childhood meetings across the state. We encourage dialogue. It's open. It's not just that the council can speak or a formal member can speak, but we include members of our communities that are doing ACEs work to really inform the work. Collaboration requires that checking your organization's ego at the door. Really important to educate the board members of these organizations about the importance of collaboration and putting children and family outcomes over performance outcomes first is really important. In doing so, giving the collaboration credit, thanking folks and making their contributions evident to the whole. And in our annual report, the first 2 or 3 pages is just thank you to folks that have contributed so much. Well, we have had very little funding to do this over the years. SCAN's budget is $75,000 a year. So if that says anything, and we haven't really had many other funds. It really does go to people sharing their work in kind. I think it's also, we've been very careful about doing our homework, reading the research, bringing it to each other, and bringing in lived experience and scientific, political, and agency-specific expertise before we develop policies off the cuff. And something that we talk about often is cheap, fast, and well done. We can pick any two, and we have been very strategic about what we have picked to do, we do that by the energy of the members, and if somebody is willing to take leadership of the work. I think really it's been very evident to us that the bureaucracies don't change from within. They have to, they change with the buildup of outside pressure. And that's what our alliance has been able to do. Even we've been very strategic about if we haven't been able to get to top leaders in the state, We have looked at mid-level bureaucracies that bureaucratic leads that have come and been participated in many of our meetings and are members of Essentials for Childhood, because they become voices with their upper folks to change the system. And we've also then have those folks there when something like legislation on the Trauma Informed Commission come through. I'd say we've also learned not to stay in our lane. You can't do ACE's work if you stay in your lane. I did have the chair of the Children's Cabinet, the former chair of the Children's Cabinet say, you're about child abuse and neglect. Why are you talking about other, this sounds like healthy child development in your annual report. And I said, yes, you're happy about that. I could tell that she wasn't. And she said, no, you should be talking only about child abuse and neglect. And I said, well, this is how you prevent. It's really about primary prevention of child abuse, and you can't prevent without looking at these other policies. We were very strategic about multiple sectors and cross-sector training. Accomplishing policy goals requires fluidity of partnerships and multiple coalitions. For each bill that we work on, we have a different coalition. And sometimes some of our members are opponents of a certain policy from an organizational standpoint. And I would use the Catholic Church, the Maryland Catholic Charities is one of our master trainers and a member of Maryland Essentials for Childhood, and yet and supportive of our child sexual abuse prevention work, but not of our statute of limitations work. You have to be really fluid in those partnerships. This is really implementation is key. It's way easier to pass a bill than effectively have it implemented. And you can't just pass a bill. Every one of the bills that we pass, we are still working on implementation. And I think be alert and ready for well-intentioned policy with unintended consequences. I think this is be careful what you ask for. Because we do have legislators bringing legislation that really is not well informed, and we're kind of diplomatically trying to look at how to move them in another direction towards a policy that will be more effective in preventing and mitigating ACEs. So there are some resources and my contact information, and I'm happy to share the slides with anyone and answer any questions. And thank you again, Dan and Jesse, for including us.
Thank you, Claudia. And please do share the slides, Councilman Cohen, if you're able to as well. That would be greatly appreciated. Such great presentation. So great to hear Baltimore City, Maryland State, and to be here, hopefully representing a national voice to sort of stack the layers and coordinate across levels of government as well as across systems like you were harping on. There are a lot of questions that were put in the chat, great engagement, so we'll get right into it. Try to finish by 3:30. I don't know what your schedules look like, but I do think that we'll go over based on the number of questions there are. So Zeke, if we could start with you from Dodie. She was curious, did the youth that you mentioned name trauma specifically? You mentioned they talked about homelessness, violence, but she's wondering how the connection was made that all of those community conditions are rooted in trauma.
So they did actually. They were not using, ACEs or PACEs or sort of some of the terminology that you all might use, but they did explicitly lift up trauma. And I think that's for a few reasons. One is that they had a teacher who is currently a member of the Trauma Informed Care Task Force who, just incredibly inspiring guy. His classroom is like this beautiful display of books, and it's just warm and affirming. It's like you step in there and you just feel better about yourself. And it is like, it's just embodies trauma informed. And he went really deep with them in helping them to process the experiences that they'd had in this shooting. And then all this other stuff kept coming out. And I think he too was unpacking some of his own trauma, because he was there too when the bullets started flying. And so, yeah, they were keenly aware of trauma. And again, I don't know that they could have like gone super deep into some of the scientific terminology, but the examples that they gave were so real and so vivid and so just powerful that, again, it, you know, touched me in a certain kind of way where I was like, this is what I'm going to spend a significant amount of my time doing for the next however long. And so the answer is yes, they did know about trauma.
Great, thank you. Claudia from JT, what are the goals to engage with the Maryland gubernatorial candidates as Governor Hogan is moving out? And are there any follow-ups with the Hogan administration as they look to move on to either the Senate or White House per speculation?
Okay, so the answer to the first question is we are members of what's called the Coalition to Protect Maryland's Children, and we're working with the Children's Mental Health Coalition and the Coalition to Protect Maryland's Children to have a gubernatorial forum. We don't have it all thought out yet, but sometime this spring. No, I know that there have been some of the candidates are very interested in this area, including one that Zeke is working with, and we've shared some of our folks in outlying counties that are really interested in the work, and I know they've had listening forums in those counties to see what's going on. And I'm sorry, but I missed the second question.
Is there any follow-up work with the Hogan administration? It sounds like there's speculation that they'll be running for either White House or the Senate.
So, well, we daily, I should say, with the work of the Trauma Informed Commission, because it's his offices that are running that commission, that are staffing that commission. So want to continue that, and hopefully they'll learn more and more before they get to the national.
It's a great example of how that local advocacy and statewide advocacy can impact federal advocacy by building relationships early on. Zeke, there is praise for your presentation from Kathleen, as well as a question of, can you share about the barriers you experienced and how you were able to apply the organizational cultural shift to the city government?
Yeah, most definitely. So thank you for that. And so a couple of challenges or barriers, one is that Baltimore City has some really, really serious sort of top of mind prefrontal cortex challenges around violence, around addiction, right? I mean, we lose 300 plus of our neighbors to homicide every single year. We lose 900 plus of our neighbors to overdose deaths every single year. We are a city that bleeds trauma, and it can feel really overwhelming for a lot of folks. And there's kind of this tension that exists within my work around people want like an immediate answer. Like people want the violence to end. People want robberies or carjackings or crime or addiction. People want it to stop, which is totally understandable. And, I want that too, but I also know that that's not what this is about. This is about generational work. This is about changing outcomes, not just now, but for the future, for the young people that are coming up to help write this bill. And so sometimes folks will say like, oh, this is great, you know, trauma informed, blah, 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 blah. But like, that's all, you know, that's a long-term goal, and that's not going to help us in the immediate. And we're a city that needs a lot of help. And so that is, you know, something that we definitely wrestle with a lot, is how can we both have immediate impact? How can we present the work in a way where folks really feel it and it doesn't feel overly academic? It's not dragged down by too much terminology or lingo that people, you know, one, don't necessarily understand, and two, don't want to hear. But that people can actually see themselves in the work that we're doing, because ultimately that's, it either succeeds or fails based on whether the city itself welcomes it and keeps open arms around it. And so far, Baltimore has been incredibly welcoming to this work, but that's one of the challenges. And then the last thing I'll say is, you know, and Claudia mentioned, but you know, there's a lot of inertia within city agencies. You know, they don't necessarily want to change. They have been raised up in a system that is highly technocratic, that is all about efficiency and not about whether folks are doing well. But in this pandemic moment, where I would argue that everyone's mental health is being tested, mine included, there really is no other way. If we don't take care of our librarians, our rec center directors, our police officers, our firefighters, if we don't think about their well-being and wellness, then they're not going to be able to do the work. So I would say that sort of shifting away from the, you know, we just need to do X, Y, Z and check boxes, into like really embracing this work has been one of the challenges. But I will say that we were really intentional about starting with the library system, because Heidi Daniel, who's the head librarian, raised her hand and said, I want in, and let's make this happen, and just has been completely engaged in the work. And so leadership matters, like the way the leader of the agency comports themselves, as you all know, matters a lot. And we really wanted was a proof point. Like, if I try this with the police department and they're like, nah, this is stupid, I'm not doing it, it doesn't bode well, right, for the Healing City Act. And Baltimore's a small town and everybody talks to each other. And so we wanted to start with an agency where we knew we would do well, and that was our library system. And so far, knock on wood, you know, even though it's all been these 400-person virtual trainings so far, we are about to jump into library branches, but it's gone well, and I hope it will continue to.
Thanks so much for that. Claudia, Carrie Sip asked a few questions. One was, how has having a community on PACE's connection helped to advance your work at the state level? And also, what sort of support have you gotten from corporate sponsors? What does that look like?
So yeah, PACE's connection has been very helpful in keeping people connected. We you know, map out where all our presentations are, what sectors, what jurisdictions. That's been extremely helpful. It's a place that we can post a lot of our information to keep folks involved in the coalition. It's a way that you know, different members of our coalition can post their own information and the things that they've been doing in their communities. So the work that Zeke's been doing has been on there, and it just keeps a lot of folks in touch. And recently, the community manager had connected us to everybody from Maryland on that maybe didn't know our page existed, the Maryland ACEs Action page. And so that was really helpful to get more people involved in the ACEs work. And as far as corporate, we've had very little funding. We've had funding from some of our partners on each of these things. we've had, the family tree supported the ACE interface project. We've had some very small pots, of money from foundations to support the ACES Roundtable facilitator and the artists that came, but really have not had. We've done this without funding, and it's you don't. In some ways, funding can be. It's really important. And I think now that we have this trauma-informed commission, it is essential for these state agencies to fund positions rather than put on other state agencies the additional responsibilities. I'm sure it's like this in most other states, but I know our child welfare system was down, our state agency was down 40% of its staff. They had lost during the pandemic, and those positions now they've hired 20% more, but the health department, all these departments are the same right now. And state agency personnel are just overwhelmed with the work. And if you put the responsibility of an agency becoming trauma informed on top of another already full plate, managing the child welfare family preservation system and CPS, or something with COVID in the health department, we're not going to get anything accomplished. It really has to be funding there. But as far as the coalition goes, I think not having funding, we've kept these people engaged without. Some people come and they think there's going to be funding somewhere. But really, it is us all acting together, and different agencies acting together with other agencies to make this happen for kids and families.
Thanks, Claudia. Zeke, are outcome measures built into this amazing work? Having those outcome measures can help us win over legislators and other policymakers to support trauma-informed policies and practices. That's a question and statement from Gary.
Yeah. Thanks for that question, Gary. That, comes up a lot, is like, what's the evaluation look like? And so we've been working, like I mentioned, there's a professor out of the Bloomberg School of Public Health right here in Baltimore, an amazing woman from the city, African-American woman who is really sharp around trauma and healing. And so we work together to come up with a set of evaluative criteria. And to be honest with you, some of it is hard, right? Like, it is a tough sell in some ways because there are so many factors and there's so much going on. But one of the sort of hard data measures that we are looking at, and we're currently sort of in the middle of our evaluation, is with the agencies that we work with, do incident reports diminish, right? So like the library system, if I go into the library and cut up and get in trouble, the librarian is supposed to write me up, and there's some penalty attached to that. However, the hope is that we are moving folks toward de-escalation, toward conflict resolution, toward restorative practices, and so that there's less need to go straight to the punitive and write someone up. And we see a parallel as we start working within our school system of trying to reduce suspensions and other disciplinary measures. So that's one hard piece of data that she's looking at. She's doing a lot of surveying around sense of safety within the spaces that we're working in, both for staff and patrons. But more to come. Hopefully within about a year from now, we will have our evaluation out there. And, again, it's always a work in progress to sort of figure out what are the right metrics. But for us, really looking at trying to reduce disciplinary action in a city that was like ground zero for mass incarceration and zero tolerance, and like the only way in Baltimore historically we've solved problems at times has been like with the hammer. We're really trying to move away from that. And so that's something that we're directly trying to measure. And ultimately, you know, if you think it long term, hopefully reduces incarceration, that's cost savings, and on down the line.
Thank you. Very much looking forward to watching that progress and hearing about how that goes. Claudia, Deb asked a two-part question. One, how did you structure the training for your legislators? And two, how are you encouraging trauma-informed workforce development, especially in institutes of higher education?
Okay, the roundtable, we had several sessions during the day. The first was really what the science was. And we had one of our ACE trainers who's exceptional and trains most of our other cohorts of trainers do that. His name is Frank Cross, if folks have seen him. And then we had Melissa Merrick share the 6 strategies of primary prevention and what was going on at the CDC. We actually had, buckets, those buckets at the table with actual buckets at the table with and put ideas for each of those different policy areas. And then we had the National Conference of State Legislators talk to them from their perspective of what they've seen in other states. And then we had a panel of folks from SAMHSA and the Delaware First Lady and Michael Castagnola from Elijah Cummings staff talk about each of their initiatives and the policies and practices and the issues that they had. There was a panel discussion. And then at lunch, we had what was a roundtable. The legislators stayed in place, but we had groups of local folks that had local initiatives go around and speak to the legislators, and they had a minute or two to tell about their initiative and how it was trauma informed. And the legislator then could ask questions, and that was very well received. And then we had a final session where they really, mapped out what they wanted to do, what were the next steps that they wanted to do with the information that they had gotten, because we had gotten a lot of feedback about having the roundtable, that many people present to them, but they don't have the opportunity to really think about the information and then how they will use it within the state legislature. One of the things that came out of it is they wanted to have an ACEs coalition, or not coalition, but Dan, you always speak of it, I'm losing the word, but caucus, yes, a caucus in the legislature, and they're still working on that. There are some rules within the legislature that don't allow them to have this specific kind of caucus, but that's still on their agenda. And then the second question again, I'm sorry, Jesse, what was the second? Or separate?
How you're encouraging trauma-informed workforce development, and especially in institutes of higher education.
We have some of our members that are working on that, but there's nothing really organized. We kind of choose our priority. We think that's a really important one. We work with researchers that are doing a lot of research in the area, but we have some of our community colleges looking at different like nursing programs or social work programs to educate their students coming out, but nothing formalized at this point.
Recognize that we are well over time, so if I may ask one more question to each of you, which unfortunately we weren't able to get to all of them. Zeke, starting with you. Tom asked, how long of a time frame will be allowed before the $2.3 million is considered or warranted a waste of money? And what is the standard to try to put on the first city to try this much needed trauma-informed training?
Yeah, so great question. Thank you, Tom. So that 2.4 million, the intent is to continue to raise money and to continue to get annual allocations each year in the city's budget. Our ARPA money, which is 1.4, is supposed to be stretched over 3 years. So I'm looking at, a 3-year sort of very short-term implementation timeframe. So I've got, this is my second term on city council. I have 4-year terms. It will most likely be my last. I don't know what I'll do next, may stay on in city government in some other role, but I'm kind of a believer in term limits and that you do your time and then you go try something different, and you kind of keep fresh blood. So, in terms of kind of me being around, I got 3 more years. And then, I hope to be able to continue in some capacity to support the work, whether it's continuing to chair the commission, the task force, or something else, we'll see. But, so basically, from now until 3 years from now is my sprint period. I want to absolutely show proof of concept. I want to show that cities that have experienced an enormous amount of racial strife, pain, suffering due to violence can heal. That's kind of our frame, is that we are a healing city. I know that that work is going to be ongoing, that it is going to outlive my time in city council and hopefully my time on this earth. But 3 years is kind of the where I want to evaluate the impact of the work. But my hope and my belief, because it's now written into law, unless someone repeals it, is that this is an ongoing project. And someone asked me a thing last night, like, when does Baltimore get healed? I don't think it ever does. I think it is about the work is the process and is about how we relate to each other and how we build community and how we impact policy, like you all are doing and like Claudia has been able to do. And it's an ongoing process that does not end. But that's part of what's joyful about it, is that we keep going despite setbacks and everything else. So it will not end anytime soon.
Thank you for that inspiration right there. And Claudia, last question to you. You brought up a police officer who was skeptical. So can you speak to how one can nurture those who are initially skeptical of trauma-informed practices to become champions themselves?
Well, first of all, I think it's education, and I think repeating. We had many people, it wasn't just that law enforcement officer. From the beginning, even people within the child abuse and neglect, they would say, why are we worried about other ACEs? We should just be talking about child abuse and neglect. And I think it's, the more people learn about the science, and I think the biology of stress, the neurobiology is really critical when we do this trauma-informed work, that we cannot forget about that, because I think trauma-informed and healing and ACEs become, buzzwords, and it's really the science that underlies and our human response to trauma that is really critical for people to understand, and that it is a biological response. It's not a choice on people's part. And I think that the more people hear those things and really understand the underlying, there was a lot of work done with that particular law enforcement officer. Our member of the council that led, he's a master trainer, has done a lot with our state police force. Other law enforcement, he's a sheriff in Harford County, and he's an exceptional trainer. And I think finding people within, if it's somebody that has the same perspective as you, the same silo as you, to talk to you. I think we always try to match our presentations, at least somebody from that particular silo with somebody else in another field, so that people understand the perspective and the everyday work that that person is coming from. And that's, I think, having those conversations really, is what has moved people, and having them repeatedly.
Thank you. Thank you for that insight. Thank you both for sharing. Thank you everyone for staying on for an extra 20 minutes with us. This was a fantastic way to start the CTIPP CAN calls for 2022. Really appreciate it. Feeling inspired going into the rest of the year. Want to remind folks to join us this Friday for the second workshop session on building the movement to prevent trauma and foster resilience. There is the sign up link one more time, and invite folks to February CTIPP CAN call, which will be about home visiting and McV reauthorization. McV is the Maternal Infant Early Childhood Home Visiting Model and Program through federal law. So we're looking forward to that. Same link every time. Go stretch, stand up, smile. Enjoy the rest of your day and week. We look forward to seeing you all again soon.